My stepmother Linda thought she had stolen my father's inheritance. She had taken our $2 million house, the investments, everything. She told me, "You have no right to anything." Until my father's attorney called me saying, "I found the real will." My father had planned everything twice. My name is David Mitchell Jr. I'm 32 years old, and I'd just discovered that the most devastating family betrayal in my life had actually been part of the most elaborate inheritance protection scheme my father had ever devised. But what Linda Carson didn't understand was that trying to steal an inheritance from someone whose father was a retired estate planning attorney wasn't just greedy. It was strategically impossible. Standing in the probate court 8 months after Linda had thought she'd stolen my inheritance, watching the judge order her to return $4.3 million in assets, plus pay criminal penalties for will forgery, I felt the deep satisfaction of my father's posthumous justice plan working exactly as he had designed it. But according to Linda's version of our family story, she had been the devoted wife who deserved to inherit everything after caring for David for 15 years. The inheritance that had been stolen and then recovered was my father David Mitchell Sr.'s estate, valued at approximately $4.3 million, including our family home, investment accounts, business interests, and personal property accumulated over 30 years as a successful estate planning attorney. To understand how Linda had been able to convince herself that she could steal my inheritance using a forged will, and how my father had anticipated her betrayal and prepared a comprehensive legal trap, I need to explain the 15-year family dynamic that had led to both her crime and his brilliant posthumous revenge. My father had married Linda Carson in 2008, when I was 17 years old and preparing for college. Dad had been a widower for 3 years following my mother's death from cancer, and Linda had been a client who had needed estate planning services during her own divorce proceedings. Linda seems like a nice woman who could provide some companionship. For your father, my aunt had told me when Dad had first started dating her, "He's been lonely since your mother passed." "I want Dad to be happy," I had replied. But something about Linda feels calculated rather than genuine. Give her a chance. David, your father is a smart man who wouldn't marry someone unless he was sure about her character. My instincts about Linda had been negative from the beginning, but I had assumed that Dad's professional experience with people and legal relationships would protect him from anyone with ulterior motives. The early years of Dad and Linda's marriage had seemed stable, and Linda had appeared to be a supportive partner who respected our family relationships and Dad's established lifestyle. "I don't want to change anything about David's life," Linda had told me during one of our conversations. "I'm grateful to be part of this family, and I want to support the relationships that are important to him." That's good to hear. Dad's happiness is what matters most to me, of course, and I hope we can develop our own positive relationship over time. Linda's initial behavior had been appropriately respectful, and I had begun to think that my early concerns had been unfounded. However, by 2015, I had begun noticing changes in Linda's attitude toward family finances and her increasing interest in Dad's estate planning and asset management. "Your father should update his will to reflect our marriage," Linda had mentioned during a family dinner. "I'm sure Dad has handled that already," I had replied. "Estate planning is his profession." "Yes, but marriage changes someone's priorities and obligations. I think it's important that spouses have financial security. Dad would never leave you without appropriate provision." "I know, but I think it's important to formalize these arrangements properly." Linda's focus on Dad's will and financial arrangements had seemed like reasonable spousal concern, but I had begun to suspect that her interest was more mercenary than protective. The first concerning incident had occurred in 2017, when I had discovered that Linda had been researching the value of Dad's assets and had been asking detailed questions about his business and investment accounts. "Why is Linda asking so many questions about your finances?" I had asked Dad privately. "She's interested in our family's financial security," Dad had replied. "I think it's natural for her to want to understand our situation. But she's asking about specific account values and investment details. That seems intrusive. David, Linda is my wife. She has a right to understand our financial position." I understand that, but her questions seem focused on valuation rather than planning. "I appreciate your concern, but I can handle my own marriage and financial decisions." Dad's response had been reasonable, but I had continued to feel that Linda's financial interest was inappropriate and potentially predatory. The second warning sign had been Linda's suggestions that Dad should limit my involvement in family financial discussions and estate planning decisions. "David Jr. doesn't need to be involved in every aspect of our financial planning," Linda had told Dad during a conversation I had overheard. "David is my son and heir. It's appropriate for him to understand our family's financial situation. But he's an adult with his own life now. Some financial matters should be private between spouses. Linda, I've always been transparent with David about family finances. That's not going to change. I'm not asking you to be secretive. I just think some decisions should be made by the people who are actually affected by them." Linda's attempt to exclude me from family financial discussions had been a clear indication that she was trying to isolate Dad from family relationships that might interfere with her own financial objectives. The third concerning development had been Linda's increasing pressure on Dad to make changes to his estate planning that would benefit her at my expense. "I think you should consider leaving the house to me directly," Linda had suggested during one of their discussions that I had happened to overhear. "The house has been in our family for 20 years. David Jr. has an emotional attachment to it. But I'm the one who's been maintaining it and making it a home for us. David has his own life and doesn't need this house. Linda, my estate planning provides appropriate security for you while ensuring that David receives the family assets that have always been intended for him. I think your priorities might need to be reconsidered now that we've been married for so long." Linda's direct request for family assets that had always been intended for me had been the clearest indication that she was planning to manipulate Dad's estate planning for her own financial benefit. However, what neither Linda nor I had realized was that Dad, as an experienced estate planning attorney, had been carefully observing Linda's behavior and had been developing a comprehensive strategy to protect my inheritance while allowing Linda to believe she was successfully manipulating him. The elaborate protection scheme that Dad had been designing had included multiple layers of legal safeguards, document verification systems, and criminal evidence collection that would ensure Linda's greed would ultimately destroy her rather than benefit her. Linda's behavior has been exactly what I expected. Dad had confided to his longtime law partner, attorney Patricia Walsh, during meetings I would only learn about after his death. "What do you mean? She married me for financial security, and she's been systematically trying to position herself to inherit my entire estate while excluding David Jr. from the family assets. How do you want to handle this?" "I'm going to let her think she's succeeding while I build an unbreakable legal case that will expose her fraud and protect David's inheritance." The strategy Dad had developed had been based on his understanding of Linda's psychology and his prediction that her greed would eventually lead her to commit criminal acts that would invalidate any claims she might have to his estate. "Linda will eventually try to forge documents or manipulate my will," Dad had told Patricia. "When she does, I want her to hang herself with her own criminal behavior." Dad's plan had involved creating multiple versions of his will, including a fake version that Linda would be able to access and potentially forge, and a real version that would be secured with Patricia and would contain comprehensive evidence of Linda's manipulation attempts. If Linda tries to steal David's inheritance, I want her to lose everything and face criminal consequences, Dad had continued. This isn't just about protecting assets. It's about justice for attempted theft from my son. The medical crisis that had triggered Linda's criminal behavior had occurred in March 2023, when Dad had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and had been given approximately 6 months to live. David, I need to make sure all my affairs are in order, Dad had told me after receiving his diagnosis. Of course, Dad. What can I do to help? I want you to know that everything I've built is intended for you. Linda will be provided for appropriately. But the bulk of my estate, the house, the investments, the business, that's your inheritance. I appreciate that, Dad, but I'm more concerned about your health than money. I know, son. But I also know that Linda is going to try to steal your inheritance after I'm gone. I want you to be prepared for that. What do you mean? Linda has been planning to manipulate my estate for years. After I die, she's going to try to claim everything. When that happens, I want you to call Patricia Walsh immediately. Dad's warning about Linda had seemed paranoid at the time, but his prediction had proven to be completely accurate. The will forgery had occurred within days of Dad's death in September 2023. Linda had presented a document that appeared to leave the entire estate to her, with only minimal provision for me. I'm sorry, David, Linda had told me with fake sympathy while showing me the forged will. Your father decided that since I was his wife, and you have your own career, I should inherit the family assets. This doesn't sound like something Dad would do. People change their minds about family relationships, especially when they're facing death. David realized that I had been more devoted to him than anyone else. Linda, Dad specifically told me that the house and investments were intended for me. Maybe that's what he said years ago, but this will reflect his final wishes. You have no right to anything. Linda's presentation of the forged will had been exactly what Dad had predicted, and her dismissive attitude toward my inheritance rights had triggered the comprehensive legal investigation that Dad had prepared, the phone call that had changed. Everything had come 3 days later, when Patricia Walsh had contacted me with information that Dad had left in her secure custody. David, your father asked me to call you immediately after Linda presented her version of his will, Patricia had said. Her version? The document Linda showed you is a forgery. I have your father's real will, and it leaves the entire estate to you with appropriate provision for Linda's immediate needs only. How do you know Linda's will is fake? Because your father and I created multiple versions of his will as part of a comprehensive plan to expose Linda's fraud attempts. The real will has security features and documentation that make forgery impossible. Dad planned this? Your father has been documenting Linda's manipulation attempts for over 5 years. He knew she would try to steal your inheritance, and he created an elaborate trap to ensure she would face criminal consequences for her greed. The evidence package that Patricia had provided had been comprehensive and devastating to Linda's inheritance theft scheme. The real will had been secured, with multiple law firms, had been video recorded during signing, and had included specific language describing Linda's attempts to manipulate Dad's estate planning as evidence of her unfitness to inherit family assets. Linda Carson has systematically attempted to manipulate the testator's estate planning decisions for personal financial gain, Dad's real will had stated. Her behavior constitutes attempted inheritance fraud, and this will serve as evidence of her criminal intent. But more importantly, Dad had anticipated Linda's forgery attempts and had created comprehensive evidence that would support criminal prosecution. Your father documented every conversation where Linda tried to manipulate his estate planning, Patricia had explained. He has recordings, written communications, and witness testimony that prove her criminal intent. The forensic analysis of Linda's forged will had revealed that she had used professional document forging services and had attempted to create a convincing replica of Dad's estate planning documents. Linda spent considerable money and effort to create this forgery. Handwriting expert Dr. Jennifer Martinez had testified during the criminal trial. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned criminal enterprise. The criminal prosecution had been swift and decisive. Linda had been charged with will forgery, inheritance fraud, and attempted theft of assets exceeding $1 million. Mrs. Carson, you systematically planned to steal your stepson's inheritance through elaborate document forgery, Judge Robert Williams had said during sentencing. This represents not just greed, but a calculated attack on family relationships and legal institutions. Linda had been sentenced to 3 years in state prison and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution and legal fees. She had also forfeited any claim to Dad's estate and had been required to vacate the family home immediately. But the most satisfying aspect of the case had been the realization that Dad had anticipated every aspect of Linda's criminal behavior and had created a perfect legal trap that had protected my inheritance while ensuring justice for her attempted theft. Your father was brilliant, Patricia had told me after the sentencing. He knew exactly how Linda would behave, and he created a legal strategy that turned her greed into her destruction. How did he know she would try to forge the will? Because he understood her character perfectly. Linda had been planning this theft for years, and your father was always several steps ahead of her. The inheritance recovery had been complete and overwhelming. Not only had I received the full $4.3 million estate that Dad had intended, but Linda's criminal behavior had eliminated any potential claims. She might have had despousal support or community property. Linda's criminal activity voided any financial rights she might have claimed as her father's spouse. Patricia had explained. She lost everything through her own greed. 2 years after Dad's death, I had used part of my inheritance to establish a charitable foundation in his memory that provided legal assistance to families dealing with inheritance fraud and elder abuse. Dad would have been proud that his estate is being used to help other families protect themselves from predators like Linda. I had reflected while reviewing the Foundation's first annual report, the stepmother who had thought she could steal my father's inheritance by forging his will had learned that my father's profession had been protecting families from exactly the kind of fraud she had attempted. Sometimes the people who think they can manipulate legal documents discover that the person they're trying to deceive understands law better than they realize. And sometimes the most elaborate inheritance theft schemes fail because they're planned by amateurs who underestimate the expertise of the professionals they're trying to defraud. Linda Carson had spent 15 years planning to steal my inheritance, never realizing that my father had been planning her legal destruction for just as long.